let's talk about this supercycle because a lot of people
What
for the past,
Supercycle?
well, that's exactly the point. Derek, let's just move on. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bit by Bit. I am Ben Bajarin.
And I'm Carolina Milanesi from the neighborhood hotel close to you. I don't know. It's like I'm doing more and more of this.
We record where we can, so just
Yes,
because
we
your
do.
background is not as colorful and enjoyable as you normally like, we still get it done. So we were both at Apple's event yesterday. I'm sure a lot of people who follow us saw our Twitter commentary as well as the most random of tweets that go viral. You probably didn't see it, but I literally just had a picture of the Series 10 on my
Mm.
wrist next to the Apple Watch Ultra, and it's now sitting on almost 600,000 views. All it was a picture, and that's it. You never know.
That's all
It's
it
the
takes, Ben, a picture.
apparently it's the strangest of things. But let's sort of talk market first, and then we'll go into some of the details. So let's talk about this supercycle because a lot of people
What
for the past,
Supercycle?
well, that's exactly the point. Derek, let's just move on. A lot of people essentially have been saying, oh, AI is going to drive a supercycle. And then when you start asking them, well, what do you think a supercycle is? They clearly have no idea what a supercycle is, nor do they recall the context of the last supercycle, which I'll just briefly lay out. So first, the only supercycle that was ever happened in the history of Apple's iPhone shipments was with the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6 Max. And this correlated with two very specific things in the moment. Number one, China Mobile was added to the network in a much larger way of support for iPhones. And this was at a time where China was clamoring for iPhones. Like they just could not get their hands on enough iPhones. So China became a huge driver with the addition of more networks and into the market. And then secondarily, it happened to correlate with a gigantic, and it's physically gigantic, screen form factor change when, I'm going to use the worst term in the world that we all hated, but when phablets were a thing and people were wanting larger devices, Apple had held off for at what 3 years probably toward making a larger phone, and boom, Apple makes a larger phone. The world goes crazy, and what defined said super cycle was the fact that it pulled forward a drastic amount of upgrades that would not have normally happened. And that was the bar in which people understood it wasn't just that you were going to sell 5% more iPhones a year. Like that wasn't the cycle. The cycle was people upgraded in mass out of an ordinary timeline. So in order to reduplicate that, those things would have to happen. And I would essentially say you would need to pull forward a drastic amount of upgrades in order to have a similar cycle. And I would just contend that the world has drastically changed from them to have a 20, and in some cases like China, there was almost a 40% bump in sales for that to ever happen again. And I just don't, and that's why I say contextually, it's just not helpful to use that because the market's not the same, and we're not going to see something like that again.
I agree. And I think that when you then look at what the 16 has to offer, and especially the people commenting that AI was going to drive that cycle, is unrealistic when you think that, first of all, hardware is usually what drives a lot of attention. And the 16 has quite a lot of distinct new features and look and feel. The Pro, not so much. So that's one first thing. And the second thing is that even if people were excited about AI, which we're going to talk about in a
Right.
minute,
Right.
it is only English speaking countries or speaking users, because it's not, what is interesting to point out is it's not country specific. If you speak English and you are in Italy, you can use it, but you understand how that already limits your appeal for regular consumers. It's still a hard
Right.
concept to understand, and you need to do it in a language that is not yours if English is not your first language. So
Yeah.
that
And it
alone
sounds like
limits
this
your
this is
addressable
a
market.
8, maybe 12-month long journey for Apple to bring Apple Intelligence to every market. And why I think that's important is China to me is one of the more interesting ones for Apple because one, while Google does have Android support for some AI features in numerous languages, they are not in China, right? China does not run Google's version of Android. So there's not a one-to-one comp there. Apple, on the other hand, can actually bring, right, a level playing field of AI slash Apple Intelligence to all of their customers worldwide. And no one else can do that.
Although I would argue, I agree with you, but I would argue that for China is going to be
Right.
interesting to see from just an ethical perspective how Apple is going to navigate that. Because I'm sure there are going to be restrictions as to how they can use the data and then what
Well, and private
of
cloud,
that
right? How
data
does private
has to
cloud
be
work
shared.
in China, where clearly they're going to need to run their servers there? But
Correct.
that's been a huge debate topic. But I think the broad point that's of interest is obviously that means it's difficult to bring to other markets, even though if they would have had Apple Intelligence universally across the markets, I still don't think we would have been having a super cycle conversation. Just the dynamics that pull forward that much demand, I just don't think we're going to see again. And this is going to be a, I was going to say, this is just going to be a
And
stronger cycle than normal, but it's not going to be a super cycle.
And to be honest with you, I do think that AI is more about a long tail than not a cycle in itself, right? Yesterday I was talking jokingly about I'm not a delayed gratification kind of person, and it feels like with Apple Intelligence and generally AI, that's what you do, right? You buy into the promise of something because not all the features are going to be available right away. And it was interesting yesterday in listening to some people saying, continue to say Apple is behind. And yes, on certain things they are behind and catching up. If you're looking at some features around camera, for instance, the eraser feature that Google has had for a long time now, Apple has cleaned up, things like that. But I think that what people are missing is that delivering Apple Intelligence, which is way more personal than not generic in some of the things that you do, and how embedded it is with the operating system is much more complex at a country level than it is for other people delivering a generic like ChatGPT, a generic AI agent. And I think that that is what is taking time. And of course, we need to also remember that there are very strict regulations as well in place. And if you're looking at Europe in particular, with something that is a phone, not a PC. And so there's a much deeper personal data set that gets into Apple Intelligence that doesn't
Right,
necessarily
right.
get
All
into
right, so
a
we don't think
productivity
there's a super
PC.
cycle coming, but there is reasons to be optimistic. And in particular, something did change this rollout cycle than past years that we think is quite interesting. So, overall impressions on the 16 lineup. What did you think?
I think that the base 16, so the regular 16, is amazing. And probably the biggest, and when I say amazing, I'm saying in the context of the base product. Historically, the excitement has always been around the Pro, even from a volume perspective. The Pro is still for the early adopters. There's always been their aspirational part, and I feel that this time around, the Pro and Pro Max are clearly for creators. Now, I qualify creators in a much bigger pool of people than not, YouTubers, because people think creators and associate with you. No, I think as video becomes more of a medium that people used to communicate and share, we're doing this now, everybody's becoming a little bit more of a creator. And so that pool of people that are interested in good video and audio is growing. But what is interesting to me is that the 16 has got the new chip. So it has the A18, and we had not had that since I believe the iPhone 13. It has all the key features, the camera controller, the action button, a better camera, new colors. all of that to me speaks to Apple wanting to upgrade as much as possible of their base so that they can take advantage of Apple Intelligence. And I think the combination here of hardware and then Apple Intelligence will make for people that have a 2, 3 year old iPhone or older really appealing. And I think it's probably the first time that we had so much excitement around the
Yeah, I
basic
think that's exactly
model
right. I think the
versus
last
the
few
Pro
years there's
model.
been a noticeable and to many people's surprise actually mix shift toward the iPhone Pro. This happened really with the 14. I saw a number of reports come out from the investment community that basically said like we didn't see this many people just going, hey, I'm going to get the Pro. So the Pro drove some real interesting mix shift, which also helped ASP, which is a different topic, but it drove an interesting mix. But that was somewhat unintended, right? I think they had always felt that most people would go for the base model, and then most people were weirdly going for the Pro, and that really I think had to do with what you pointed out, that there was a lot of attractive Pro features, even if they didn't use them. The better camera, right? The better camera, the better video. I don't really think it had
Especially
anything
around
to
the
do with size. I
camera.
think there was
Yeah.
just such a big bump in tech specs, and then I don't think this really played into it, but it was just it's just a thing to note is that typically the base level did not get the latest generation processor, and that's gone on for around 3 years. And the issue there, honestly, was not so much Apple's; it was just securing wafers at TSMC in order to have enough on the leading edge for their entire lineup, right? Because they're going to sell 200 plus million phones. That's a lot of wafers. So they did have to split the SoC, and this year they didn't, right? And so now I think you're right. I think we're looking at a probably a mix shift back toward the 16, because again, unless you're like, oh, I'm gonna make videos at home, and or you really want the bigger screen, like the 16 is a very attractive piece of technology with I think more parity technologically than we've really ever seen between those two lines. And so I think you're right. The 16 is going to be extremely popular, and I don't know if it's too much of a limb to go out on to say it might be the best-selling base model for Apple than probably we've ever seen.
I think it will be. It's just too much of between the software and the hardware. It just feels like the perfect product. And to be honest with you, even on the hardware side, there is enough for people to buy it, knowing that Apple Intelligence will come. But then, even if they're not interested in
I
Apple
do just want
Intelligence and they just
Genmoji,
want
to be entirely
Genmoji.
honest with you. All right, so we think there'll be a stronger cycle than normal. We think the mix shift will probably go back to the Pro. I say all of this publicly recapping so that we can come back to it when we're inevitably correct. And so so let's move to AI. So I've really been struggling with this because I've sort of said this multiple times, and I just think it's an interesting thought exercise that we're making so much of a deal of this term when the term AI doesn't mean anything. What it means is it enables something that you find useful as a feature. And so when people start saying, "Oh, it's going to be driven by AI," like it's too ambiguous. It's more but we don't have a way to articulate this. So I understand that moment. But if we never if the chat GPT moment never happened, and we never this idea of generative AI or natural language interface to interact with objects never happened, we would just look at these features. Anybody, right? Not just Apple. Look at Google's features, and people would just say, "That's really cool. That's super helpful." Whether or not we ever mentioned what the underlying technology was useless. And I say this to say it seems like it's not helpful to just say AI is driving this. I don't have a good term for it, but it would be better if we just said something like AI enables XYZ, and XYZ is interesting and valuable, but it's just not articulated that way. So I say that to say it's an ingredient technology. It is it is something that enables the things, but people were like, "Oh, Apple didn't talk enough about AI," and it's like, but they talked about the features that AI enables, as did Google at their launch. And I think that's the right approach versus getting real hung up on, the ingredient. It's more about like, well, what's the sum of all the parts that it enables at the end that I think is the more valuable part of the equation, but that does not get talked about enough.
It's interesting because obviously you and I were chatting about this yesterday, and I agree with you. I think is what is hard is because everybody's talking about AI. If you don't, then you're immediately seen as, oh, you're behind, you're not. And I think as an industry, nobody's going to pull back first, right? And so that thing about AI, whatever that means, because it also means very different people, very many different things to different players. And I was joking yesterday when you put out the tweet saying that, and I said, well, AI is the starter to the sourdough, and although people talked about the starter a lot during COVID because we couldn't get it, but at the end of the day, what matters
Right.
is the bread, right? That you eat. Like nobody really cares about the sourdough, the starter itself. And to some extent, you're right that, certainly from a consumer perspective, they're buying into a feature. And that's why we joke about Gemoji, but that is going to be the thing that people are going to see, understand, and understand how AI as an enabler creates the Gemoji. But in other cases, we don't. It becomes like magic, right? When we give you examples of, or it's gonna, people understand correcting your writing because you had an editor or a spell check for years. Now it's just smarter, and that's what it is. In a lot of cases, I think we are overplaying the word AI when in
Right.
reality
Right.
is just smarter than it used to be. Because the algorithm is better, because the data set is larger, for a whole bunch of things is faster because of the silicon that you use it to run on it. But it's become such a big marketing drive that I feel that, sorry to say, Ben, I don't think we're going to get to the point where we're not going to talk about
Right.
it until it's so pervasive.
Right.
Then people
Exactly.
are not. But this
Yeah.
is an industry problem. It's not a technology problem, right? It's just the fact that, as I said, if you don't talk about it, you're perceived as being behind. When you have it everywhere, and then that is not your differentiator, but what you deliver
Yeah,
on it
and I think
is,
it's
then
again,
we're
right.
going
I
to
think
stop
you're
talking
you're
about it.
exactly right, and the point is that this is the moment because just think about how you talk about these sorts of features because obviously it was asked to us yesterday, right, by media, friends and family, like anybody, like, hey, I got calls afterward, like, hey, how are the phones? And you say, okay, well, there's a different art to the conversation to, um, yeah, imagine that you write an email and an AI fixes it for you. They're like, well, what does that mean? Versus like you write an email and you click this button and it'll do a proofread and it might change it to your tone. It might give you creative options. Like I could never say the word AI and they'd be like, oh, that's interesting. Or that it summarizes your messages in a way so that you don't have to go and read all of them, right? And so versus like, oh yeah, you get AI summaries of messages. Like that doesn't mean anything. And so I think that's just where I feel like the industry needs to get more articulate is my point. Really do the work to highlight the end problem that's being solved versus just saying AI, right? And even like I appreciate Apple using words like new transformer model, but what does that mean? Like what? Okay, where? And so I just that's what I'm saying. Like people keep doubling down on this term because you're right. At some point in time, it's not going to matter. Everything will be enabled. And then the other hard part about this is where we're at in the adoption cycle is most people don't know it's useful until you try it. So it's sort of very hard to jump to
Yeah.
I have no context, so why do I want it? To I've used it. Wow, that's really interesting. I'd like more of it. And we're in this gap time where it hasn't diffused. We're in the innovator's dilemma. It will get there, but this is always a very weird time because people don't have context for why they should care.
I do think that part of it, though, is also the fact that I first and a lot more people than just me call out for transparency, right? And so I think part of the this is AI is marketing, but part of it is also ethics and being transparent about when things are done using your data and whatnot. And so I think it's that balance as well, because we tried, because people have tried to sell it as magic, and people get freaked out because they see things happening and they don't understand what is happening necessarily. So you start to be more transparent and explain that that is AI, even if, to your point, people still don't understand what it actually means. But you start to open up a little bit, saying, well, it doesn't just happen by magic, right? There are things in place that make it happen. So I think there's a little bit of that, and I think all of it basically signals that this is extremely new, and everybody's trying to figure out how to best deliver the message so that is enticing to buyers, not scary. And I think
Yeah,
sometimes we get carried away
agreed.
and
And I think
overpromise and
that's why
underdeliver.
everybody is taking a more controlled rollout to this. I think Apple's taking more conservative approach than Google, but I think Apple exactly, and I think it's because what
As
you
they
pointed
usually
out
do.
in our discussions was they have a much larger and uh, different group of consumer base in their installed base, because they go everyone from technology bleeding edge early adopters to grandma and grandpa. And it's like there's very few
Yeah.
people that really span the diffusion of innovation with just one product. And I joked about this on a podcast I was on last week. I was like, you just can't bring bleeding edge AI to grandma and grandpa day one. Like they're not gonna know what to do. And so you have to bring the base accordingly, but still have something for everybody. And I think that's what makes Apple's opportunity, but also a challenge in why they're going to be more conservative in their rollout of these features.
Yeah, I agree. And is the technology savviness level, is the age group, is the countries, and so the languages, and the fact, to your point, that Apple has one model, but also the fact that Apple Intelligence is deeply integrated into the OS, and so it's not a feature that you can choose to use or not use. I mean, you can still, obviously, but it's so deep into the device that, for instance, if you look at Samsung, they have large volumes like Apple. They do play in as many countries as Apple does, but they don't control that end-to-end experience on their devices. And so, they pick and choose how they can do it. And they are dependent on, at the end of the day, what Android does as far as how deep into DOS they can go. So it's a bit unique, really, what you have on the iPhone.
Yeah, agreed. Well, we will uh, we will see how this plays out. Apple Intelligence, I think, will be a continued point of discussion as it rolls out in more timeline, but we'll follow that and discuss it more as we got time with it. So, thanks for listening, everybody, and we will talk to you next time.
Bye.